Today we are continuing the story of addiction, but particularly focusing on alcohol this morning. And let me ask you a question. How many of you are either alcoholic yourselves, you don't need to identify that bit necessarily, or have a parent or a sibling or a child who is alcoholic? Okay? Usually when I ask that question, it's at least half the room of people have a close family relative or themselves have struggled with alcoholism. So it's close to you, and some of you may have chosen, because you have families with alcoholism, to be teetotal, that you don't drink at all because you've seen the havoc that it's caused in your families. But we have to ask ourselves, as we did yesterday, what is our relationship with alcohol in all its different forms? Because it's about your relationship with it that we're talking today. So in a book that I have been reading recently that was actually given to me by an alcoholic, called Drinking, a Love Story, by a journalist called Caroline Knapp. This is, again, set in the United States, and she talks at one point where about her husband used to say about this woman's mother. He said, when Nan gets bombed, drunk, she goes off into some little room in her mind and pulls down the shade. The line struck with me for many years. It was quite unlike anything I'd ever read about drinking or drunks, quite contrary to the images of alcohol I'd encountered in the past, the manly and tough drinker, or the smooth and elegant drinker. She goes off into some little room in her mind and pulls down the shade. Without stating so explicitly, that image had to do with the places that alcohol can take you. It had to do with transportation and the very real and to alcoholics enormously seductive phenomenon of taking psychic flight, ingesting a simple substance and leaving yourself behind. I read it over and over and over. You see, everywhere we look, we're told that this liquid makeover from the inside out is possible. The knowledge creeps inside us and settles in dark corners, places where fantasies lie. We see it on billboards, in glossy images, in magazine ads, in movies, on TV. We see couples huddled together by fires, sipping brandy, flames reflecting in the gleam of glass snifters. We see elegant groups raising celebratory glasses of wine in restaurants. We see friendships cemented over bar stools and dark bottles of beer. We see secrets shared, problems solved, romances bloom. We watch, we know, and together the wine, beer, and liquor industries spend more than $1 billion each year reinforcing this knowledge. Drinking will transform us. And it does, at least for a little while. It melts down the pieces of us that hurt or feel distress. It makes room for some other self to emerge, a version that's new and improved and decidedly less conflicted. And some hundreds of years ago, Samuel Boswell wrote in the life of Johnson, I drink alone to get rid of myself, to send myself away. Wine makes a man better pleased with himself. So for this woman, she says, drinking was the best way I knew, the fastest and simplest way to let my feelings out and to connect with other people, because she tended to be pretty shy. To connect with another human being. The comfort was enormous. I was an easier, stronger version of myself, as though I had been coated from the inside out with a warm liquid armor. With a warm liquid armor. Wine, she remembers wine and that melting ease, wine and that sense of yielding to sensuality. When I was with men I loved, drinking felt the most natural ally, the most reliable route to a kind of internal softening. When I was conflicted, insecure, angry, I drank. Alcohol flipped some switch. Click. It worked its familiar magic. It turned me not into someone who laughed and danced and felt sexual. But later on in her alcoholic career, she said, flash forward an hour or two, no memory of what had happened. Nothing at all. About 1/5 of the population in the United States don't drink at all. About 2/5 drink moderately. Another 2/5 abuse alcohol in some way, and 1/5 abuse it very extremely. As I said yesterday, it's the 1/5 who actually drink the most alcohol, just liters and liters and liters of it, way beyond one's imagination. So the normal standard for, as you probably know, for healthy drinking, that there is such a thing as healthy drinking, is for women, it is 7 drinks a week. Now I will define drink in a moment because that's important. What does that mean? It's actually a lot less than you think. It's a small amount. And for men, it is double that, 14 drinks for men. And both of these numbers are for men and women under 65, because once you get over that age, your body may be more sensitive to the effects of alcohol. And not only that, it should be no more than 3 of those drinks in a day. So you might have 3 one day and 3 2 or 3 days later, and then 1 the next day in a week. But beyond that, you're getting into the danger of unhealthy drinking, or what we might call frequent drinking. This tends, as you know, as I said yesterday in my own example, to creep up on you, somewhat unawares, and you know that when you are anxious and when you're afraid and maybe when you're self-conscious, like the woman I just read about, when you're disappointed, when you're angry, alcohol takes all these things away. Fear plus alcohol leads to courage. Self-consciousness plus alcohol, and you're socially relaxed. But alcohol makes everything better, as this woman says, until it makes it worse. She said, I loved the way drink made me feel, and I loved its special power of deflection, its ability to shift my focus away from my own awareness of self and onto something else, something less painful than my own feelings. I loved the sounds of drink, the slide of a cork as it eased out of a wine bottle, the distinct glug-glug of booze pouring into the glass, the clatter of ice in a tumbler. I loved the rituals, the camaraderie of drinking with others, the warming, melting feelings of ease and courage that it gave me. And later on she says, without being completely aware of it, you organize your life so that alcohol is always there. It's at the table at dinner. It's in your cupboard and your refrigerator. You hang out with other drinkers. I see some knowing smiles in the audience here. You know what that's like, don't you? You can relate to this. On that margin of low, safe drinking to frequent and perhaps somewhat risky type of drinking. And then we have binge drinking, of course. And here, this is, as I said yesterday, is much more common in young people, in the 17 to 18 to 25-year-olds. In the United States, 25% of the 17 to 18-year-olds binge drink. Now, periodic heavy drinking is in fact more damaging to the body and the brain than a slow, regular, smaller amount, because you have high toxic levels surrounding your cortex, your brain, and getting into it. It damages your ability to plan and to make decisions and to delay gratification. Your ability to plan, to make decisions, and to delay gratification. So the more you drink, the more it affects your brain, the less ability you have to choose not to drink. That's where the disease model, as we'll see, actually is somewhat helpful, is that you bring about a disease upon yourself by your choices, a disease of your brain. So in rats who are soaked in alcohol, live rats who drink too much, who actually can be genetically bred to drink a lot, their hippocampus and their frontal lobes are affected. And those are the places of memory formation, and the alcohol actually suppresses the formation of new neurons. So that's probably happening in teens who binge drink. And interestingly, other studies have shown that when this happens, you have a loss of flexibility, and it's much harder to unlearn bad habits and to learn good new habits. So you've learned to drink, and you've trained yourself to, and now your brain is so poisoned that it's much harder for you to learn the better habits of not drinking. Okay? So it's gradually poisoning your system, and especially with the binge drinking. Now, binge drinking is men, we usually define as men who have 5 or more drinks on one occasion. Well, for me, I'm very sensitive to alcohol. 2 would put me under the table, probably. I have a hard time being around men who drink 6 or 7 beers in a row. I don't know how their bodies hold it. I can imagine them being up all night peeing. And also, how their brains deal with it, I cannot imagine. Women, they say 4 or more on one occasion is the definition. This is again in the United States of binge drinking. And in this situation, of course, you have the complications of passing out, of missing work, of having a horrible hangover the next morning, of feeling sick, of driving drunk, of getting into fights. All those sorts of complications go with the binge drinking scenario. So this is damaging the body, risking your career, risking your relationships. But you may go for 2 days binge drinking, and then the rest of the week you're fine, so nobody else really knows about it. You may get back to work and be okay. I've talked about the teens and drinking. Now, a family history of alcoholism does lead to a greater risk. Half of the risk of alcoholism is genetically determined, they estimate. And they've even done studies to try and narrow down which genes, and out of 4,000 genes, they've narrowed it down to 75 genes. And probably these 75 are all working in conjunction with each other, because none of our behavior is just one gene. It's a complex of genes interacting with the environment, and your environment may actually turn on some genes and turn off some others. So a child of a biological parent with alcohol dependence raised in another family, so even if you're adopted at birth, you have a biologically alcoholic parent, even if you're adopted at birth, you have 4 times the risk of developing alcoholism. Or if you have a sibling too, that raises the risk 4 times. And it seems that family and environmental factors are more important when people are younger, in other words, in their teens and 20s. As you grow older, though, obviously those things become less important. It may be more of your social environment in your work and places like that. This woman who wrote this book, Drinking a Love Story, says, I grew up in a confused home. Her father was a psychoanalyst, and he was a functioning alcoholic. Most people didn't know. She says, I grew up in a confused home, and the drink for her, which she started drinking around the age of 14, made the confusion go away. It provided the easiest way out, an escape from my internal life. So she had the genetic vulnerability and the environmental family vulnerability.
Yeah.
So it's hard to distinguish the cultural and the family environmental influences. But certainly, I always say to people, if you have alcoholic in the family, you need to be careful how you drink and whether you drink. My wife has a fairly strong history of alcoholism in her family. I have absolutely none at all in my family. But I can see the influence on the way we approach alcohol. And I think what happens is for people who do inherit this predisposition, they have a diminished sensitivity to intoxication. In other words, they don't get intoxicated so quickly in terms of getting drunk, but they do have a heightened sensitivity to the anxiety-reducing effects. So it works for them like a medication much more easily. And I mentioned yesterday, too, there are some Asian cultures ranging from Turkey to the Far East. There are some people who have a genetic predisposition where they get ill if they drink alcohol. And of course, there is a higher risk of alcoholism in people who have other psychiatric disorders, like depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so on, because in a way they are self-medicating with the alcohol to take away their anxiety. So we talked yesterday about the signs of addiction. We used the language of abuse and dependence, which now in the United States is becoming called alcohol use disorder, which embraces both abuse and dependence. As this woman Caroline Knapp says in her book, by the end, it was the single most important relationship of my life. It's the single most important relationship of my life. So you develop tolerance. You need more to get the same effect. You have withdrawal symptoms. I'll talk a little more about those in a moment. The loss of control. You find that you can't anymore stop yourself from going for that second, that third drink. You attempt to cut down or quit without success. You tend to focus on the alcohol much more and less focus on other things. And this leads to continuing despite the consequences. So you ignore the problems in perhaps your financial situation, your missing work, the car accident that you may have, the relationship problems. So there is this person, Caroline Knapp, says there are a long list of reasons to drink. Losses, stressful job, messy romantic life. So I drank a little too much. It's situational. I deserve it. I'm stressed out. I'm depressed. I've had a bad day, a bad week. She says that this is the classic logic amongst functioning alcoholics. There's always a reason why it's okay to have another drink. You rationalize it. She says liquor creates delusions. It can make your life feel full of risk and adventure, sparking and dynamic as a rough sea under sunlight. A single drink can make you feel unstoppable, masterful, capable of solving problems that overwhelmed you just 5 minutes before. In fact, the opposite is true. Drinking brings your life to a standstill. It makes it static as a rock over time. So she describes very well this internal world of the gradual slipping down into using it this way. So the sort of questionnaires that we have that are helpful in England, in the United States, general practitioners, counselors, quite often use this very simple, what's called CAGE questionnaire. Have you ever felt that you should cut down your drinking? Have people annoyed you by criticizing your drinking? Have you felt guilty or bad about your drinking? Have you had a drink first thing in the morning to steady your nerves or get rid of a hangover? That's the rather difficult E of the cage, the eye opener. So these are simple questions that actually do go to the heart of the problem, don't they? Do I need to let you write that? You can look this up online. It's available everywhere. I just want to switch out of the PowerPoint for a minute to take you to something else, which is a useful. This gets into what a drink is. Okay, this is developed in a number of countries. This is the Australian government's version of it, of the audit, the alcohol screening test. And you can see here what a drink is, okay? When we say 7 drinks in a week. Now look at the 100 milliliters of wine. That's not a lot of wine. Half a relatively small glass. A light beer. A smaller glass of full-strength beer. Very small amount, 30 milliliters of spirits, and so on. So this questionnaire, which you can get on the internet very easily, asks again slightly more than the questions of the cage questionnaire, but how often do you have a drink containing alcohol? Never, monthly, 2 or 4 times a month, 2 to 3 times a week, 4 or more times a week. How many standard drinks do you have on a typical day when you're drinking? How often do you have 6 or more standard drinks on one occasion? How often during the last year have you found that you were not able to stop drinking once you'd started? How often during the last year have you failed to do what was normally expected of you because of drinking? How often during the last year have you needed a first drink in the morning to get yourself going after a heavy drinking session? Guilt, remorse in the next question. Unable to remember what happened the night before in the next question. Have you or someone else been injured because of your drinking? Has a relative, friend, doctor, or other healthcare worker been concerned about your drinking, suggested you cut down? And then they give you a scoring, how to score and interpret the audit like this. So this is something that I think that is really a useful tool. Now, when you're counselling, very often, I tend not to use formal tools very much. But if you have all these questions in your mind, you can have a pretty good clue. But if you want to help someone to have a more objective measurement, and it's often useful to do that because it's a jolt to their system, it's a jar to their system. And one of the problems, of course, with alcoholism, it's also a disease of denial and deceit. So it's hard to know whether people are telling you the truth when you ask them these sorts of questions. So one alcoholic expert says he always doubles the figure that they give him. I don't know whether that's fair or not, but that's one way of dealing with it. So there's a useful tool available for you. And then another, so if we have this idea very often, especially amongst people who are struggling with this definition of being an alcoholic, they often have in their mind an alcoholic is the sort of Skid Row bum who's drinking alcohol out of a bottle in a paper bag on the side of the street. And obviously there are all sorts of different types of alcoholic. And this woman who's writing the book that I'm quoting from is one who is a functional alcoholic. In other words, nobody really knows that she is except maybe her best friends. But this is the way, this is a helpful distinction, I think. There are young adults, about nearly 32% of alcoholics in the United States have few mental health disorders, little family history. They've just got into binge drinking and then more and more drinking in their youth. The young antisocial often have the 21% of these, and 50% of these have a family history of alcoholism, depression, anxiety, smoking, other drugs. So a fairly addictive background. And then the functional, almost 20%, middle-aged, well-educated, stable jobs and families. I went recently with a friend in Chicago to 3 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and they took place in a pretty affluent area of Chicago. And most of them were these functioning alcoholics. They were wealthy, had good jobs, dressed well, very articulate, but about 200 or 300 of them meeting in this church building. I'll tell you a little more about that later, and Dusan's going to tell us about the 12-step program. Then what they call intermediate family, and I don't like that definition of it. 19% of alcoholics, middle-aged, a strong family history of alcoholism, depression, bipolar, smoking, and then the chronic severe. They started young, often have been in jail or in criminal behaviors with mental illness and other drugs. And those are quite often the homeless folk that we see in the cities. So this person, this functioning alcoholic who writes this book, says alcoholic is a nasty word. Alcoholics love hearing about the worst cases. We cling to stories of them. These are the true alcoholics, the unstable and then lunatic, the bum on the subway drinking from the bottle. She says, I never missed a day of work because of drinking, never called in sick, never called it quits, went home early because of a hangover, but inside I was falling apart. The discrepancy was huge. Beneath my own witty professional facade were oceans of fear, whole rivers of doubt. So she was able to keep up appearances. This is the functioning alcoholic. And there are many of those amongst doctors and lawyers and counselors. And this that movie I mentioned yesterday, Flight, the pilot, he would be another, at one level, functional alcoholic. So if we look internationally, you know what this looks like already, I'm sure. Where does the heavy drinking occur? That's in the black. Top right. And just let you digest that for a moment. But let me give you that breakdown in terms of countries. You can get this map. I think actually it's from a Wikipedia site on drinking. But the average amount consumed by those who are over 15 years old per capita between 2008 and 2010. Belarus gets first prize with 17.5 litres. Moldova, Lithuania, Russian Federation, Romania, Ukraine, Andorra, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Portugal, those are the first 10. And then number 25 comes the UK. And you see the global average there is 6.2. So now it's not nearly as available in some countries, but even where it's not, people usually make their own. But the USA is down at around 9.2 there. Now, when we look, we mentioned yesterday too that women are more vulnerable to abuse of alcohol and its harmful effects because they metabolize it in a different way and more quickly. And women also are, more than men, have histories of sexual and emotional abuse in their families. So the complications for women may be that, when they're drunk, they have a sexual relationship and they get pregnant or they get a sexually transmitted disease. As alcohol takes a hold on their bodies, it erodes their bones, so they're more prone to osteoporosis and falls and fractures. They may have premature menopause. They're more prone to infertility and miscarriages. more prone to hypertension, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease, and more vulnerable to breast cancer. So there are a lot of negative things for women in drinking. Now, we mentioned yesterday too that there are certain health benefits, such as the lower risk of heart disease and stroke for both men and women with small quantities of alcohol. But there are many other lifestyle factors involved. That people who tend to drink less are also people who probably tend to eat more healthily and tend to get more exercise, and so on. So the dangers to health, as I've mentioned, in both men and women now, you're prone to digestive problems, obviously eventually to cirrhosis of the liver, to heart disease and stroke, to brain damage, especially with the binge drinking, with your neuronal networks are affected so that you have less inhibitory impulse control. You tend to go for self-gratification more quickly. The cancer risk of cancers of the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the liver, the colon, breast. Alcoholics tend to smoke more, with all the dangers of that. Drinking and driving and all the dangers of that. The interaction with other medications, and then disinhibition and violence. The rates of murder and suicide and sexual offenses, domestic abuse, child abuse, they're all much more highly associated with alcoholism. So just on these grounds, you can actually understand why some people feel that alcohol is such an evil that you should ban it completely. That marijuana is much safer than alcohol, they would argue. It has its own problems. Yeah. So what then can we say about the steps to recovery here? As I've said, denial is a big part of this. So most alcoholics will say, most people who are problem drinkers believe that they can stop any time. They minimize it, saying, I have a few drinks now and then. I don't drink too much. They rationalize it. I'm going through a very stressful time. If you had my boss, my wife, my husband, you'd drink too. And of course they deceive themselves. Alcoholics lie about big things, and we lie about small things, says this writer. And we lie to other people, and above all, we lie to ourselves. It's too painful to face reality and be honest. We live double lives, she says. As my drinking progressed, I learned to be more discreet. We hid what we drank, and when we drank it, and how much, and under what circumstances. We hid it from our friends and families. We often took pains to hide it from total strangers. You lie. You deflect blame. You rationalize. And the hole that you dig yourself gets deeper and deeper. You deny first your drinking, and your denial stretches to include more and more bits of reality. And after a while, she says, you cannot see the truth. You cannot see your own role in the disaster you've made of your life. You cannot see who you are or what you need or what choices you have. You drink to drown out fear and rage, but they often come out more forcibly when you're drunk. You get drunk in a paradoxical way that numbs feelings and gives you access to them at the same time. You get drunk and you get furious. You get drunk and said all the things you were afraid to say, sober. Now, in the middle of all this, she describes having wake-up moments when for a short while she came to the morning after the party and wondered what she'd said. and what she'd done and how she'd embarrassed herself, and had she had sex with someone, and did she kill someone when she was driving home. But she said those moments came fleetingly, and then she drank again to get rid of them. So there's the deceit of self, of others, the lying, and for some people, they may need from those that love them an intervention. Have any of you been involved with an intervention with alcoholics, drug addicts? But so the intervention that I'm meaning is where the family members know that their brother, sister, father, mother is an alcoholic, and they plan with a psychologist or a counselor or a pastor to meet with the person who's the alcoholic. It's a surprise meeting. You don't tell them. You may lure them to some office or some room, and then the family who have met together before and talked about this intervention with the counselor or psychologist, each in turn will tell the person how their drinking or their addiction has affected them in the past, and it's often helpful to get them to write it down so they can read it, how it's affecting them now, and how it will affect them if they go on drinking in the future. And if they do not get help, then there will be some very serious consequence. The wife might say, I'm going to leave you, move in with my in-laws, take the children with me, and you'll be on your own, unless you go and get help. And we have arranged for you to go to this rehab center if you are willing to go. So that's one area that you have to think about, and it's not something to go into easily and lightly. So there is hope for alcoholism. There is change. It's a difficult process. Any addiction, I think, and this is why many churches shy away from dealing with addictions, because it's such a difficult thing to deal with. So approximately in the United States, 10 to 30% abstain or seriously limit their drinking without treatment. So they may come to their senses themselves, or they may have a warning from a doctor saying, your liver is showing abnormalities. How much are you drinking? And he goes through an evaluation with them, and they get scared enough to be able to do something about it themselves. And cutting back on your own is possible. It has to be an incredibly disciplined process. And usually it's helpful, just a few practical things here, to write down a list of reasons to curtail, to cut down on your drinking. To set a drinking goal, to keep a diary of your drinking. Not keeping alcohol in the house. When you go out, many alcoholics drink much too fast, and they have to learn to drink slowly, to sip their drinks. To have alcohol-free days or weekends or even months, as we said yesterday, to ask for support, to be persistent. So there are a small number, and I think these are the people who are sort of on the edge of problem drinking, who can pull back from it. Those who are deeply entrenched in the alcoholic addiction pattern will almost certainly need some help. And with treatment, these are figures again from the United States, 50% relapse in the first 3 months. This is with medical, psychological, Alcoholic Anonymous support. And with treatment, 17 to 35% are abstinent after 1 year. That's not a very high success rate, is it? And maybe Dusan can tell us about his success rate. These are, it's interesting when you look at, and I don't know how much to trust these statistics, but the Christian programs that have been going for a long time in the United States, the one that appears to have the highest success rate with addictions is Teen Challenge, which does deal with adults as well now. And it is a strongly Christian program, rehab, and it takes people out of society for a year or two and then gradually helps them back in. That seems to have higher results than these figures here. So the steps to recovery are partly education, all the things that we've been talking about, educating about the damage to the brain and what that will mean, evaluating them with the questionnaires of the seriousness of the problem, asking the question, is detox necessary? And here it depends on the level of addiction and the seriousness of the withdrawal symptoms. Some drugs have very strong withdrawal symptoms, and Glenn will tell us more about that later on. With alcohol, especially with the functioning alcoholic, they can often do it on an outpatient basis and not necessarily have to go into rehab or hospital. But people who are prone to withdrawal symptoms, so you may, after drinking for a long time, people may have seizures. They may have delirium tremens or auditory and visual hallucinations, shaking, sweating, fatigue, muscle tension, headache, nausea, and vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, all these serious symptoms which can to some degree be controlled, especially with the use of drugs like Valium and Librium, which are usually given just for a short time so that the person doesn't become hooked on that too, somewhere between 2 to 5 days to help them over that initial withdrawal period. So that could be done in hospital or out of hospital. It's interesting, some other people too have found that helping alcoholics when they are tempted to, because of the brain's difficulty in delaying gratification, if you can learn to wait with any serious addictive temptation, if you can learn to wait 5 or 10 minutes, and this is the key with Alcoholics Anonymous, they usually tell you when you're tempted, call your sponsor. That gives you something to talk about, something to think about differently for 5 to 10 minutes. If you can get beyond that, the temptation begins to subside again. Some have found that listening to music calms you and enables you to have a more accurate estimate of time and consequences, because alcoholics have been found to have I forget the technical term for it, I think I have it here, what is called temporal discounting. It's the tendency to view small rewards that are available now as more desirable than even much bigger rewards when you get down the road. So your brain you tend to go for immediate self-gratification, as we said earlier on. It's also helpful to, I think, with all addictions, is to revision the future. In other words, to say to the person, imagine what your life will, just think with me about what your life is now, and then think what it will be like in 5 years' time if you continue drinking or continue with your sexual addiction. And then what will it be like if you stop drinking now, or if you stop that other addiction. So there are various ways of working with them, helping them to develop insight, identifying the triggers. You know, it's often people are very emotionally unaware of what is happening in them. Especially children of alcoholics have a really hard time naming and identifying emotions. So if you can help them to become more aware, even to keep a journal and say, when I really felt tempted, now I can recognize that I was feeling really angry, or feeling a lot of shame, or feeling really hurt and disappointed, or feeling really sad or bored. And once you can name the feeling, then you have a way of beginning to deal with that feeling. You look for ways of dealing with it in a different way. So it's identifying triggers, learning to find ways to prevent relapse. Great. So looking for places where you can make a different choice, not to go in a certain direction, do a certain thing. Yeah, and then medication. There are different forms of medication that can be used, and the naltrexone is usually, well, let me start with the antabuse. Is that what you call it here? Is that the same name? This is something that you give people so that when they drink, they feel nauseated and will throw up. So that's like a deconditioning. You have a negative experience when you drink. The more popular one nowadays, certainly in the United States, is naltrexone, which is a drug that has been developed which reduces craving for any addictive substance. So again, it's something that helps to diminish just the physiological brain mechanism craving for the substance that your brain has got so used to. And you're dealing, of course, with the psychological awareness as an interesting quote here from William Styron, who is someone who suffered from very serious depression. In his book, Darkness Visible, he vividly described what happens when a drinker, I presume this was him, is suddenly left without the armor that we talked about earlier, the liquid armor. Left without the self-constructed wall that stands between the self and acute self-awareness. Suddenly vanished, he writes, the great ally which for so long had kept my demons at bay. It was no longer there to prevent those demons from beginning to swarm through the subconscious, and I was emotionally naked, vulnerable as I had never been before. Without liquor, which had turned on him suddenly, Styron felt numb, enervated, and fragile, subject to the dreadful pounding seizures of anxiety. So all the psychological effects of withdrawal, now you haven't got that thing that you had that kept your anxiety at bay. And this is where you cannot do this on your own, as we said yesterday. You need a support group. You need other people with whom you can talk. And not just an individual counselor or pastor, but a group of people. And this is where Alcoholics Anonymous, developed back in the 1930s in the United States, has spread all over the world. And I'm not going to say much except just to show you the 12 steps on the screen and then let Dusan tell us about them later on. As I said, I went to this meeting in Chicago, and what really impressed me with the meeting was that here were a lot of folk who were incredibly encouraging to each other. It felt like church. It felt like what church ought to be. There were people, and people were given the opportunity to get up and to give a little bit of their testimony, and they all start with, I'm John, I'm an alcoholic. And the person I was going with had their first anniversary, so they were presented with by their sponsor with a birthday cake and a candle, and everyone claps and cheers. And there were others who had their 25th anniversary, or others who had their 1 month anniversary. So there's this tremendous feeling of support. And you realize when you come out of that building, actually a huge number of them were smoking, interestingly, so they have sort of double addiction. And by the way, the statistics show that people who break the two habits, smoking and alcohol together, usually do better than people who try to just get off alcohol and keep smoking. And then they had a little sort of mini sermon from someone about one of the 12 steps. They didn't do any singing except Happy Birthday, no worship songs. So you're saying Henry Cloud draws the parallel that says in church, if you say you're an alcoholic, everyone is embarrassed and they are shocked, and yeah. Whereas we are, as we said yesterday, we're all sinners. And in a sense, that there's a place for creating small groups within the church. And my little community group in the church, we have developed a habit of really sharing some of our deepest struggles together. All sorts of different struggles, not necessarily addictions, but it's a place where we can be really honest with one another. So honesty with other people, as you can see from these steps here that I put up, that many of you probably know, and I'll leave for Dusan to talk about in a moment. But one of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous is you take it a day at a time. And what it gives you, what the 12 steps give you, only one of them mentions alcohol. The rest of them give you a structure for living, a structure of accountability, of discipline, of making restitution, of forgiveness. And in a way, that's what the Christian life does, isn't it? It gives you a structure, a way of being, alternative to the one you have lived before. It's putting off your old nature and putting on your new. Now your new identity as a Christian is an identity in Christ. Your identity is not as an alcoholic. And of course, that's one of the dangers of AA, is that, and Dusan can say more of that too, is that it may become in itself your identity, your church, the thing that you revolve your life around. This becomes your new God, a healthier sort of God, but not the true God. So sobriety, early sobriety, says this woman in the book, has the quality of vigorous exercise, building up emotional muscle. It's tiring, it's wearisome. There are the daily choices, 100,000 daily choices. Do I make the alcoholic choice or the healthy choice? When I'm hungry, angry, lonely, tired, they often use this HALT, H-A-L-T. Am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? So identifying your emotions. What choice am I going to make? And she says the alcoholic choice usually feels warm, fuzzy, comfortable, and protective. And the healthy choice feels dangerous, scary, threatening, and painful. But you make that choice to drink many times a day. And one of the things I think that happens is that alcoholism essentially prevents you from growing up. Drug addiction, any addiction, when you start using, say at the age of 13 or 14 or 15, you remain emotionally at that age. And when you come off at age 25 or 35, you're still emotionally 14. So you have to start to learn to grow up, learn to to develop feeling emotions, and then how you manage them in a more healthy way. So it's ideally it is a spiritual awakening. Now the spirituality of AA is often very different sort of spirituality from Christian spirituality, but obviously many people who are Christians, who are alcoholics, come back to the Lord, renew their commitment through this, reclaim their original Christian values, deepen their faith, and know that they need to know the grace and forgiveness of God, and they also need to ask forgiveness from many, many people in their lives. Because, and Evan is going to take us into this theme of working with families, they say in Al-Anon that for every alcoholic has affected at least 4 other people in their lives, pretty radically, and probably more. It's a ripple effect that goes out. But living with an alcoholic is an incredibly unpredictable life. So you have all the effects that come down through the next generation and the next generation of the children of alcoholics, with these having lived with fear, with shame, with frustration and anger, with depression and anxiety, with hopelessness, with unpredictability every day of what's Dad going to be like when he comes home today. Is he going to be that lovely, playful, fun guy, or is he going to be a dragon, an evil ogre in my life.